Welcome, welcome everybody to another in our series. This is an extension of our showcase that we did in January. A lot of our customers felt that there was some fantastic speakers there, and sometimes the 4 minutes wasn't just long enough. And of course, our speakers completely agree with you. Now, one of the many reasons why we decided to go global some years ago was that we wanted to really bring diverse thinking across the world. Just really open up boardroom the minds of boardrooms across the globe into thinking a little differently. And I think this morning it doesn't really get more different and more diverse than Alex and Renias and their sort of view on the power of relationships. Renias is not with us this morning because he had to. Well, maybe Alex will explain in more detail. But we do have Alex here as to take us away. So over to you, Alex. I'll let you introduce yourself, and looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak once again. Yes, usually Renias Mhlongo would be with me, but he is, I'm afraid, in the Kruger National Park tracking a very notorious gang of rhino poachers. I don't know if anyone knows, but the rhino poaching has spiked since December again. We were getting it under control, and now something's happened. The markets in China have turned, and so there's a greater demand, and so we're seeing it on the ground. So Renias cannot be with us. Usually he would be with me, and he would be telling you stories which I translate. But I am a white 14th generation South African. My family arrived in South Africa just a little over 300 years ago. The man on the screen, Renias, who I've just mentioned, he's just a third generation South African. But more importantly, he's one of the last people alive today to be raised on the original traditions of a Shangaan hunter-gatherer. Ren was born in a mud hut underneath a jackalberry tree in a place that is today part of the Kruger National Park. 30 years ago, the two of us were thrown together to become ranger and tracker, to take paying guests out on safaris. And I'll show you some pictures just now. And what followed has been a 3-decade-long journey that has profoundly changed both of our lives. And that's a little bit about what I'd like to tell you this morning. Unfortunately, he can't be with us at this moment. Ren would normally be telling you where he comes from, and he's an incredible storyteller. But I'm going to carry on, and you'll get a good sense of where we come from. In 1995, exactly 30 years ago, as I said, the two of us were thrown together at Londolozi. I was 19 years old. Ren was 32 years old. I'm from Plettenberg Bay. Renias was born in the bush, as I mentioned. And I arrived there having gone on my game ranger training, 1-year training course, thinking that I was the all-knowing, all-seeing guide, safari guide. And it didn't take long before I realized that Renias was in complete control of that safari. I remember my first ever lesson as a young game ranger was taught to me by a leopard, but very much facilitated by Renias. We had a group of 6 people on our vehicle that come for 3 days to Londolozi. They were from Canada. They told me they'd saved their whole lives to save up to come to Londolozi with the express purpose of seeing a leopard. And as some of you may or may not know, but Londolozi Game Reserve markets itself as the premier leopard viewing destination in Africa. I remember being at the wheel of my Land Rover. The front wheels dipped into the donga, the dry riverbed of the Mashaben, and Renias leant back and he banged on the bonnet like this from the tracker seat. And he said to me, "Yima, yima, yima." He says, wait, in his language, Shangaan. And he pointed down. And I stopped the vehicle, and he jumped off the front of the tracker seat, and he walked round, and he pointed at something, this most obscure, inconspicuous little mark on the ground. And I walked around, and I said to him, "Ren, what's that?" And he knelt down, and he drew with his finger around this little mark in the sand. And he said to me, "Mkonzele, Iwa Tugwana." He said, "These tracks are of the Tugwan female leopard." This was the first time we had confirmation that there were leopards around. For 3 days, we'd completely struck out. This was the last morning game drive of these Canadians. our last chance to get them to see a leopard. And they were very disgruntled by this stage, and they were disappointed, and they'd totally lost faith in me, their 19-year-old guide, and this tracker on the front to find a leopard for them, despite all their savings and all their time. What would normally happen is if Renias found leopard tracks like that, he'd get off the vehicle and he'd jump off and he'd go into the bush with a rifle and he'd go and follow those tracks. And then he'd call me on the radio if he found anything. But that day was different. He invited me to come along with him. I remember my head swelling as I hauled the rifle off the rifle rack. I winked at my Canadians. I said to them, I'm going to go and find you a leopard, as if I did it every day. But that was the first day I'd ever done it. This was the first time Renias had invited me to come along with him. Now, I was to take the weapon. After all, I'd been on the Cleve Cheney Advanced Rifle Handling course. Thankfully, Renias had never seen the results of that course. But more importantly, I was to be the eyes of the operation. That as Ren would be following the spoor in the sand on the ground, my job was to look up, so that if we found this leopard, we'd have a good chance of seeing her before we got too close to it. We told our Canadian guests, you stay in the Land Rover, you're safe. And we set off down the riverbed. I took this photograph a year or so later. It was the exact same place. The tracks of this leopard, the Tugwan female, went straight down the riverbed in the sand in a southeasterly direction, and we began to follow. Not 30 or 40 meters down, I noticed Ren's whole body language had begun to shift. I remember thinking to myself, I wonder what he knows that I don't. And I was looking in all the bits of shade, trying to keep up my side of the deal. As we went further and further down the riverbed, Ren went slower and slower until he stopped. And he knelt down again and he drew another circle with his finger around another track. But this one was perfectly clear. It didn't take a tracker to see that this was a leopard. He kneels down, he says to me, he says, this track has walked now. This animal's close by. As we got going again, about 60 meters down the riverbed, a tree squirrel starts to make an alarm, a warning call. Krrr, krrr. Now, tree squirrels alarm for eagles, snakes, at each other, leopards. We had just seen an African hawk eagle go over a few moments before. We weren't certain, was the squirrel irritated by the eagle we've just seen, or was the Tugwan female right there? This just added to the tension. There were a few logs that had been washed down from the previous year's flood. I put my foot on the log. As I took the next step, this leopard explodes out of the bush. From a tail, comes from side to side. Now I try and back up, and I trip over the log I just stepped over. The animal screams straight up to me and slams with one paw on the log I just tripped over. Sand hits me in the shins. She's right over me. I can smell her breath. Renias standing off to the left of me says to me, hey, my jomban, Hima. He says, my jomban means small boots. He says, Hima, wait. I thought, I'm not going anywhere. In the meantime, this animal is coming at me, and I'm just waiting for it to bite me in the throat. And inside me is developing this internal battle that says, you must get up and run away. And my head is saying, no, it's kind of, you must stay where you are. That's kind of what you're trained to do. Still off to the left of me, Ren says, okay, he says, don't look her in the eye. So I looked down, but this made it worse. But her growling was absolutely deafening. He then says to me, okay, Tana Hanzako Katsongo. He says, come back slowly. So I thought, I'm not so sure this is the right advice. And I hesitated. He says to me, Hema Jomban, small boots. Tana Hanzako, come back. I thought, well, I'm in no position to start negotiating. So I just shifted my bum in the sand like that. And I noticed this leopard started to relax. I thought, oh, great. And I started to move back quicker. He said to me, whoa, Katsongo, slowly. The more distance I put between myself and this animal, the more she relaxed until she went back into the bush. And what we'd realized is she had these 2-3-month-old little cubs stashed away, hidden in the bush, and she was just protecting them. My rifle was smashed out of reach. Protector. I was nobody's protector that day. In fact, Renias went and collected my weapon out of the sand and unloaded it. But I realized Renias didn't really need me there that day. He already had a protection. His experience, the fact that him having seen this kind of thing before, was his weapon. He put me there to put me into a position where I could learn. Now, eventually, I'll just say as an aside, we could not take our Canadians back to go and look at that leopard. She was just too aggressive by then. She would have eaten somebody that day. Fortunately, another guide found another leopard, a friendlier leopard, and we went and we showed our Canadians that, and that animal, and eventually they went back to Toronto happy having seen a leopard, but not because Alex van der Heever was a particularly good tracker. Now, seeing Renius's competence, seeing the way he supported me that morning, made me feel like I could really trust him. But I had to see it first. And especially in these economic and political times, especially in this country where distrust and suspicion is so much a part of our society nowadays, we all need to work so much harder at showing our trustworthiness, just like Ren did that morning in the Donga. Anyhow, about 18 months later, one day right out of the blue, Ren comes to me. By this stage, I'd got a bit better dealing with big cats on foot. And he says to me, why don't you come and stay for a couple of nights at my home village called Dixie? He says, I'd like to introduce you to my family and you can see where I live and so on. Now, to be honest with you, I wasn't so keen to go to Dixie. I was there to see leopards and track lions and be a game ranger. And the media had told me that a location, a place like Dixie wouldn't be a place where a white person would be welcome. And I knew that just 25 years earlier, Renias and his family were evicted in a harrowing ordeal, which he will tell you one day, a story you will one day hear. And I thought, why would somebody who's been evicted from their land now bring the culture in who made those evictions, who made those persecutions? And so I said, no, Ren, I don't think I should come to Dixie. But he wouldn't let up. And eventually I got the sense if I didn't go, it would have a material impact on our working relationship. So almost out of desperation, I said, okay, all right, I will come. But I wasn't particularly keen. Now, Dixie is in a remote area. Ren can hit a tennis ball from his house into the Kruger National Park. It was set up during the apartheid days in the early 60s as a socially engineered place for where black people can live outside of the game reserves. Renias' family lived inside the game reserve. They were evicted and sent to Dixie. And now I'm going to visit him there. About 70% of the people in Dixie lived in these mud huts. Mud they collect from termite mounds to create the walls, and then grass they cut, bundle, and make the roofs. There were only about 400 people who lived in Dixie at that time. There was no running water and no electricity. Renias had had a job for about 10 or 12 years by this stage. So he would have been considered one of the more affluent members of the Dixie community, and he lived in this home. A very simple air brick house with a zinc roof. It was a Friday afternoon. I arrive in my baby blue City Golf in the front of Ren's house. People direct me how to get there. And I arrive at his front door, and him and his wife come up to greet me. And they invite me in. And I walk into this little narrow passageway. And there's a door on the right. And Renias opens the door. And there's this beautiful bed and this very lavish headboard. And he says to me, this is my room. I said, oh, that's nice, Ren. He says, this is where you're going to stay. I said to him, no, man, Ren, I can't stay in your personal space here. He says, no, you're my VPI guest, he says to me. His bed is definitely king-sized. And this most ornate headboard with these like Cape Dutch gables, and built in the middle of the headboard was a built-in wireless radio. And I always remember there was a white cloth banner across his bed that said, I love you. I'm not sure if he had it there for me. If he did, no problem. And I always also remember a picture of Claudia Schiffer on the wall that said, "My darling." He told me he'd saved 6 years for that bed and headboard. How many of us sitting here today would move out of our own personal bedroom for somebody from a culture different to ours, who we'd worked with for, say, a year or 18 months, to go and sleep in? I can tell you there are not many of us. Anyhow, that evening, Renias showed me to many of the, introduced me to many of the people who lived in Dixie. Of course, some I knew because they were staff members who worked at Londolozi and also lived in the village of Dixie. That night, he says we're going to have supper at 7 o'clock. And I thought to myself, well, we're probably going to eat pap and maroch, traditional food, Shangaan food. Pap is a crushed maize, as many of you know, and maroch is a traditional spinach, which is highly nutritious, which they pick in the bush and cook. I arrive in Renias's kitchen in Dixie on the first night to discover that he's organized for the off-duty head chef of Londolozi Private Game Reserve, who lived in Dixie and who was on leave for the same time, to come and to cook for me. This man over here, Dumi and Glovo, the man on the far right. If I can get my annotate to work. Well, no, I don't want to complicate things. This man on the far right, in the white t-shirt, he may not look like much, but he recently won a cooking competition against the Australian Master Chef champion. This is a serious chef. We ate gourmet. There was no traditional food involved whatsoever. And by the way, whilst you were on this particular slide, that's Renias's mother, Anania, who was born on the same day as Nelson Mandela and died the day after he died. And the little boy in front of me is Renias's young son of 6 years of age, called Nature. And of course, Renias. And we had an incredible evening. We sat around the fire. I listened to stories and I learned about what mattered to these people. I began to learn about what was troubling the people of Dixie. And I learned more about Ren and his family in those 3 days than I had in the whole 18 months or so of working with him. The next morning, I get a bang on my door. Gang, gang, it's a steel door. Gang, gang, gang. And it's Renias. He says, "Hey, Alex, would you like to go for a bath?" I said, "Yeah, I'd love to go for a bath." He had a bath installed in his house, but of course, he opened the taps, nothing came out. There's no connected pipe to water. And I wondered, we're probably going to have to go to the dam or something to go and wash. I wasn't sure. 45 minutes later, the door just bursts open. And his little boy, Nature, of 6, and his little girl, Angela, of 11, came staggering into my room and gave me this bath. I promise I won't keep it up for very long. It's a bit revealing. I want you just to consider, though, the effort that went into that bath. Those kids had to go in the bush, collect firewood, come back, make a fire. Then they had to go to the borehole, which was 2 kilometers away, with a wheelbarrow and collect water. And I calculated probably 25 kettle loads of hot water went into making that bath. This is the most profound bath I've ever had in my life. Now, I have stayed at a few 5-star places around the world, but the spirit of hospitality at Renias's house was beyond anything I'd ever experienced before. This was extreme hospitality. This was the ultimate form of giving, particularly when you consider the limited means from where it came from. It did not cost Renias much money to put together what he did that for me that weekend. The years continued to roll. I began to learn to speak Shangaan. I had been introduced to his family. I began to learn about his culture. And for the first time, I was able to access Renias beyond the superficial. I was able to access his ideas, his beliefs, his thoughts in a way that I hadn't been before by learning to speak his language, Shangaan. And I started to look for a way to reciprocate. And I eventually found a perfect example, or a perfect opportunity, let me say, to give back to Renias. I invited him to come with me to London. Renias had never been outside the Kruger National Park. He'd never been to Johannesburg. He had not flown in an aeroplane, and he'd certainly not seen the ocean. And we were off to the center of the world. And I remember we flew on Virgin Airways. And I remember this because Virgin, as far as I know, was the first airline to produce the personalized TVs in the economy class of the airplane. I remember we got on again, by the way, the shoe was on the other foot. Now it was my turn to convince him to go into the unknown. And the first thing I said to him was, when I said to him, let's go to London, he said, only if we can walk, he says. He'd heard that he's going to have to drive. He'd heard we were going to have to fly. And we've got on to Virgin Airways. He'd obviously agreed. He wanted to come. He was actually quite excited in the end, but he was dead afraid of the airplane. And I tried to distract him, and I showed him how to use the personal TV. And there were 6 or 8 movies playing on the TV. And I remember he set it on Die Hard. And we took off out of Joburg. And a few moments into the flight, I see he switches it from Die Hard to watch that digital map that you can watch the breadcrumb trail of the plane if it makes its way painstakingly slowly up the continent. And I said to him, Ren, but there's nice movies here. Why don't you watch the movies? He says, no, I like the map, he says. 11 and a half hours later, on short finals into Heathrow Airport, he nudges me like this. He says, hey, Boetie, if we ever have to come back here by driving or walking, I know the way now. And we had an incredible 2 weeks in London, and when we do our live presentations, we talk a lot about that trip. But when we got back to London, something happened. Renias always says, something happened in London that helped us track leopards better. As I alluded to earlier, Londolozi Game Reserve is famous for its leopards. If you go there, you are virtually guaranteed you're going to see one. The problem is that leopards are incredibly elusive. They're hard to find. And with my increased levels of exposure to tracking and my great growing time with Renias in the bush, it became apparent that what Ren could do in the bush, very few of the other trackers could. It was often that we were the ones, or he was the one, that would find the leopard when all the other trackers and guides had gone home for breakfast. And a new kind of relationship started to emerge. One with a wild animal. For some reason, we started to really get successful at finding this leopard. Her name is the Mungen female. And we don't really know why, but we had a much greater success rate with finding the Mungen's tracks, following her tracks, and eventually finding her, and then most importantly, being able to get the vehicle with the guests in to view her. So there's a multi-step process. You've got to find the track, it's got to be a fresh track. Then you've got the task of now trying to track and find that leopard. And now you've got to find it in a way you don't scare it. Then you've got to get to it back with the Land Rover, with the guests, and get the guests to take a picture of it. That process is not easy. And only the best trackers can get that right. And it was clear that Ren started to be able to do this much more successfully than any of the other trackers. I remember there was one story that I'd love to share with you. One morning, it was late in the morning, we found the Mungen, this leopard that's on your screen. We found her at about 10 o'clock in the morning. The guests were hot. They wanted to go home for breakfast. We'd been on foot all morning. You could see they'd run out of patience. They didn't understand what we were doing. We were sort of staring at these little obscurities in the sand and telling them we were going to find this leopard, and they thought the whole thing was just a story. Eventually, we find her, and I spot her at about 150 meters. She's down in an old quarry. I lift my binoculars, and I can see that she's hunting something. And I look very carefully, and I can see in the grass, she's stalking a group of banded mongoose. I can also see that she's incredibly hungry, that she hasn't eaten for a few days, and we hadn't seen her for about 10 days. And I said to Ren, well, there she is. Let's go. She was in the open. I said, let's go and get the car and get the guests in. He says to me, no, wait. He says, let's walk with her for a bit. I said, but Ren, but she's right here. The guests have been waiting. He says, no, wait. He says, let's walk. I say, you want to walk with the leopard? He says, yes, let's just go a bit closer and see what's wrong. He said, and because Ren always had great empathy for animals. He could sense that the fact that she was hunting these mongooses meant something was wrong and that we could see she was hungry. So he didn't want to immediately bring the vehicle in. We start to walk towards us. She turns and she looks at us and she keeps stalking. We close the gap from 120 meters to 60 meters. She shows us no aggression. We close the gap to 20 meters. She shows us no aggression. She eventually loses interest in the mongoose and climbs up onto a termite mound. Ren and I are within 20 meters of this wild leopard. We notice, as she notices, vultures going down on the horizon. I notice her glance in reaction to a bird that starts alarming off to the right. She comes off the termite mound, she walks down into the woodland, and she goes into a full-blown stalk. She drops into a full-blown stalk. And Renias and I are looking, and we can see through the trees. We can see a small little antelope called the duiker. There comes a situation where there's the mungen in a stalk, Ren to her left, me to her right, in this unlikely trio of a human wild animal hunting team, hunting this duiker. She shows us absolutely no aggression. Eventually, she goes closer and closer. Eventually, Ren signals, "Let's pull out here. We're gonna destroy that. We're gonna destroy the hunt. We're gonna make a noise because we can't stalk like a leopard." And as we start to back off, she rushes, but she misses the duiker. Something happened that day with that leopard. In the weeks and the months that followed, she would come out of, we'd be in the vehicle, she'd come out of the bush and she'd come straight towards us. I had no door on my side of the Land Rover. She'd come right up. I could virtually touch. I never did touch her. She'd come and she'd lock eye to eye. She'd look at me in the eyes and then she'd produce this chuffing sound, this sound. And we never knew what that sound meant. Nobody had ever heard it before. I asked many leopard researchers. I asked big cat specialists. No one could tell me. Much later, John Varty told me that tigers chuff as a part of a greeting. We had formed a relationship with this animal, and it was through Renias's masterful, refined, traditional skills of tracking that allowed us to do so. A few months later, she was spat in the eye by a Mozambican spitting cobra. You can see her right eye, your left on your screen. The eye is blue. She went blind. I took this photograph not long after she was spat in the eye by the cobra.
Sorry,
And
Alex,
this was
we need to wrap up now.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is the last. Let me get through.
Yeah.
This was the last
Okay.
time I ever saw her. Would you like me to wrap up or can I keep going for another 5 minutes?
You're going to have to wrap up because we had 20 minutes all in and then Q&A
okay.
after that. Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna skip this. I'm just going to skip to the last slide here. The people often ask Renias and I, how do we create relationships without it taking 30 years to do so? And we've got 3 basic universal behaviors that we think have helped us, which we think can help businesses too. The first is be accepting. When you offer acceptance, people feel like they belong. To the contrast, if you offer judgment, people will filter, they'll hold back, and you will create a fake environment around you. The second is be curious. People want to be understood. They're desperate to share what's important to them. And curiosity is the antidote to implicit bias, what plagues our country. And finally, be warm. This may sound fuzzy, but it's not. Warmth is what makes the other 2 work. When you warm, people feel emotionally secure. And if you feel emotionally secure, they'll trust you faster. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. Are there any questions? Anybody wants to put anything in the chat or come off mute and ask Alex directly?
Just a comment from me, Alex. It was a great story. I mean, it's Monday morning, and you're taking us on an adventure. And look, I can't speak for everybody else, but I could listen to you for hours. I think you have some fantastic stories. I think you really represent South Africa amazingly well when you go out into the global circuit with Renias. You're both real characters. I watched him in Las Vegas, and you know, you would ask him to go somewhere or do something, and he doesn't look at the normal, you know, the whole expo like we all would, because we used to expos and so on. And you would just tell him, go track, go find what you need to do. And yeah, he's just got an incredible way of seeing things, and it's that whole diverse thinking that we really love. So yeah, I just want to thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
And helping our customers understand a lot more of what the two of you do, and what an impact it can make in their organizations.
Thank you, Paul.
Is there anybody else who wants to say something? Clive has said here in the chat that you're correct, Paul. Alex is a fantastic storyteller. I could listen to you all day, Alex. The stories are truly captivating. And then Debbie said, exceptional bond the two of you share. Wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Kathy. I was under the pressure. We had the hour. Sorry about that.
No, no problem. It was 20 minutes and then a bit of Q&A afterwards.
Okay, all good.
Okay, not a problem. So if there's nobody else who would like to ask a question, I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to see this awesome speaker, Alex. Thank you very much for a great session. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, doing good for the wildlife. And we're sorry that Renias couldn't join, but we do wish him well, and hopefully he can catch some of those poachers in the Kruger Park. Please don't forget to join us next week, same time, same place. Bilal Kathada will be one of our 5-star speakers then. Thank you, everybody.